Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. And today we're going to be updating the meeting DRAC page. As you can see, there was the table for the Japan trip. I can very easily remove that, one click, and move that over into the section that is done. Just take off the bold. And now I can confirm that the Northern European trip that should have happened this year is going to happen next year, so I can put that in as upcoming, put it in bold. And of course, the Naval History Conference that I'm hosting on HMS Belfast, which hopefully you should have also seen a community announcement about earlier today, if you're watching this on the day of release. Well, I can put the link in to get tickets now, because that's all ready to go live, but I don't like the length of that link, so I'm just going to hyperlink it with a very handy hyperlink function, make that bold so people can see what's going on. And then I'm just going to change the title of the talk that I'm giving because, well, I've decided to give a different presentation. And over the course of the next week or so, I shall be updating the names and titles of presentations for the various other presenters who are going to be there, along with a timing schedule and everything. But essentially it runs from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., although the presentations finish at 4. So keep an eye on that. And if you want to come along, well, obviously there's the ticket link down there. Nice and easy, all done with Squarespace. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Well, we're now just a fraction over 84 years from Pearl Harbor, so as is kind of a loose channel tradition around the time of the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attacks, there's a video that's something to do with Pearl Harbor without actually covering the attacks themselves, because, yeah, a lot of people have done that. Nonetheless, today we're going to take a little bit of a quick fire run through where all the US's capital ships were on December 7th, 1941, so you can get an idea of how much of the US fleet was impacted, and of the US fleet that wasn't impacted, what state was it in, and of course, crucially, where was it? So how easy was it to redeploy? All other things like fuel and so forth notwithstanding. Now, obviously, if we go through every single cruiser, destroyer, etc., we're going to be here forever, probably still be here when the 85th anniversary rolls around. So instead, we're just going to look at the US carriers and battleships, covering all those that were in existence in some form or another on December 7th, 1941. So, let's start with the carriers. USS Langley, America's first carrier, therefore CV-1, was still around at this point. Now, granted, she hadn't been an aircraft carrier for a little while, in the technical sense. She'd been converted to a seaplane carrier, and for the last couple of years, she'd been stationed in the Philippines, and indeed, that's where she was on December 7th, at anchor off Cavite in the Philippines, although for obvious reasons she had to get shifting pretty quickly after that. USS Lexington, CV-2, was one of the carriers that was actually assigned to the Pacific Fleet, and she'd left Pearl Harbor 2 days earlier, on December the 5th, on a mission to reinforce Midway, so she had additional aircraft aboard. She was actually still on her way to Midway, about 500 miles southeast of the island, when the call came in that Pearl Harbor was under attack. USS Saratoga, CV-3, had been at Bremerton on the northwest coast of the continental United States for a refit for most of 1941, and toward the end of the year had headed south, obviously working up after a long refit, and on December 7th she was at San Diego about to take on her brand new air group. USS Ranger, CV-4, was on her way back up to Norfolk after having undergone a training exercise in the Caribbean. USS Yorktown, CV-5, was sitting quite happily at anchor in Norfolk, Virginia. USS Enterprise, CV-6, had left Pearl Harbor on the 28th of November on a similar mission to Lexington, although since she left earlier, technically Lexington was on a similar mission to Enterprise. But Enterprise's destination was Wake Island rather than Midway. She'd actually been due back at Pearl Harbor the day before, on December the 6th, but she'd been forced to slow down due to bad weather, and thus was actually due in on December 7th, although later in the day. As it turned out, that was a saving grace for her because it meant that she was still out at sea, away from the Japanese attack when it developed, and although some of her air group, a variety of Dauntlesses that were sent ahead to land early, were shot up and, well, returned fire as well, and she ended up entering Pearl Harbor just a little bit later still, understandably so, she was, however, safe from the Japanese attacks, but she would come the closest of all the US carriers to potentially having been detected and attacked by the Japanese on that day. USS Wasp CV-7 was in, of all places, Grassy Bay in Bermuda. She'd been playing quite an active role in what were loosely termed the US Navy's neutrality patrols in ever-increasing sections of the Atlantic, which were in reality more kind of no German U-boats allowed, please go home patrols, designed to assist the British war effort as much as was technically possible within the bounds of neutrality without actively declaring war on Germany. And USS Hornet CV-8, the last of the Yorktown class, was in the middle of her working up trials based out of Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia on the Atlantic coast, as she'd only recently been handed over to the Navy after finishing her construction. And that was all the US carriers that were actually afloat, but there were 5 other US carriers that technically existed in some way, shape, or form. The Essex, the Intrepid, and the Bonhomme Richard, which would later be renamed to USS Yorktown after the loss of CV-5, becoming USS Yorktown CV-10, and interestingly enough, obviously 2 of those ships, the Intrepid and the now Yorktown, are still around as museum ships, were all under construction at Newport News Shipbuilding, although it should be noted that Bonhomme Richard, later Yorktown, and Intrepid had only been laid down a week before Pearl Harbor, so they existed as a collection of keel plates and not much else. Elsewhere were the USS Cabot, as apparently it's called, not Cabo, which would later be renamed to USS Lexington, which, interestingly enough, is also a museum ship down in Corpus Christi in Texas, and the Bunker Hill, obviously quite famous for the horrific attack she suffered toward the end of the war. They were both under construction at the Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. So that's all the US carriers that were in existence, and before anybody asks about the Independence class, yes, technically the hulls were already under construction. However, they were under construction on December 7th as light cruisers. It would only be in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor that they would be reordered as light carriers, and therefore it's not really appropriate to list them here. Then, of course, we move on to the battleships. Now, there were, of course, quite a number of US battleships at Pearl Harbor itself. So there was the Utah there as a training vessel, Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Tennessee, California, Maryland, and West Virginia, which meant that of the standard type battleships, 3 entire classes, the Nevadas, Pennsylvanias, and Tennessees, were all represented, and the Colorado class had 2 out of its 3 ships there as well. And of those, Utah, Oklahoma, and Arizona would be permanently sunk. Nevada, California, and West Virginia would be sunk, but then would be salvaged and returned to service, and Pennsylvania and Maryland were only damaged and didn't actually sink at all. But what about the rest of the US battleships? Well, USS Wyoming was cruising off the coast of Maine on a training exercise. USS Arkansas was nearby at anchor in Casco Bay in Maine. USS New York was under refit in Norfolk, Virginia at the Norfolk Navy Yard. USS Texas was keeping the Arkansas Company in Casco Bay. USS New Mexico was in Norfolk Navy Yard near the New York, but she was being made ready to be sent to the Pacific. USS Mississippi was in Iceland on a neutrality patrol guarding US shipping alongside the USS Idaho. USS Colorado, the missing member of the Colorado class at Pearl Harbor, was missing because she was undergoing a modernization refit at Puget Sound, and near her, also undergoing a refit, although in her case after bomb damage, was HMS Warspite. And that's all the US battleships that were in active service at the time, but interestingly, every single other US battleship that would ever be commissioned, that is, the fast battleships of the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes, were actually all in existence in some way, shape, or form on December 7th. The North Carolina was undergoing sea trials in the Atlantic. The USS Washington was undergoing specifically high-speed sea trials in the Atlantic, because obviously that class had quite a lot of issues maintaining top speed without vibrating horribly. USS South Dakota was in the process of fitting out at the New York Shipbuilding Company, which, confusingly enough, given the name, was actually based in Camden, New Jersey, not a million miles away from where the USS New Jersey is currently sitting. The USS Indiana had very recently been launched onto the James River, and she was fitting out at Newport News Shipbuilding in Newport News. USS Massachusetts was fitting out at the Bethlehem Steel Company in Quincy, Massachusetts. And the USS Alabama, last of the South Dakota class, had yet to be launched. She was still on the slipway at Norfolk Navy Yard. Then we come to the Iowa class. The USS Iowa was on the slipway at New York Navy Yard, while the USS New Jersey was on the slipway at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and each of them had a stablemate. The Missouri was nearby the Iowa at New York Navy Yard, and the Wisconsin was near the New Jersey at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So that's a quick summary of where exactly all the capital units of the US fleet, both in existence and in the immediate future, happened to be on December 7th, 1941. So I hope that's of some use to you in working out exactly how the US fleet was dispersed at the end of 1941, just before they were catapulted into the active part of World War II.